Dr. KHALID MALIK, the founder of Applied Linguistics Groups, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL and uploaded this video for BS English students. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities, and was admitted to a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at.
Difference between the British and American English. The British actually introduced the language to the Americas when they reached these lands by sea between the 16th and 17th centuries. At that time, spelling had not yet been standardized. It took the writing of the first dictionaries to set in stone how these words appeared. In the UK, the dictionary was compiled by London-based scholars. Meanwhile, in the United States, the lexicographer was a man named Noah Webster. Allegedly, he changed how the words were spelled to make the American version different from the British as a way of showing cultural independence from its mother country. In terms of speech, the differences between American and British English actually took place after the first settlers arrived in America. These groups of people spoke using what was called rhotic speech, where the R sounds of words are pronounced. Meanwhile, the higher classes in the UK wanted to distinguish the way they spoke from the common masses by softening their pronunciation of the R sounds. Since the elite even back then were considered the standard for being fashionable, other people began to copy their speech, until it eventually became the common way of speaking in the south of England. There is an old saying that America and Britain are two nations divided by a common language. No one knows exactly who said this, but it reflects the way many Brits feel about American English. My British friend still tells me, "You don't speak English. You speak American." But are American and British English really so different? Vocabulary. The most noticeable difference between American and British English is vocabulary. There are hundreds of everyday words that are different. For example, Brits call the front of a car the bonnet, while Americans call it the hood. Americans go on vacation, while Brits go on holidays, or holes. New Yorkers live in apartments, Londoners live in flats. There are far more examples than we can talk about here. Fortunately, most Americans and Brits can usually guess the meaning through the context of a sentence. Collective nouns. There are a few grammatical differences between the two varieties of English. Let's start with collective nouns. We use collective nouns to refer to a group of individuals. In American English, collective nouns are singular. For example, staff refers to a group of employees, band refers to a group of musicians, team refers to a group of athletes. Americans would say, "The band is good." Everyday words that are different. But in British English, collective nouns can be singular or plural. You might hear someone from Britain say, "The team are playing tonight," or "The team is playing tonight." For example, Brits call the front of a car the bonnet, while Americans call it the hood. Auxiliary verbs. Another grammar difference between American and British English relates to auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs, also known as helping verbs, are verbs that help form a grammatical function. They help the main verb by adding information about time, modality, and voice. Let's look at the auxiliary verb shall. Brits sometimes use shall to express the future. For example, "I shall go home now." Americans know what shall means, but rarely use it in conversation. It seems very formal. Americans would probably use, "I will go home now." In question form, a Brit might say, "Shall we go now?" while an American would probably say, "Should we go now?" When Americans want to express a lack of obligation, they use the helping verb do with negative not followed by need. "You do not need to come to work today." Brits drop the helping verb and contract not. "You needn't come to work today." Past tense verbs. You will also find some small differences with past forms of irregular verbs. The past tense of learn in American English is learned. British English has the option of learned or learnt. The same rule applies to dreamed and dreamt, burned and burnt, leaned and lent. Americans tend to use the ed ending, Brits tend to use the t ending. In the past participle form, Americans tend to use the en ending for some irregular verbs. For example, an American might say, I have never gotten caught, whereas a Brit would say, I have never got caught. Americans use both got and gotten in the past participle. Brits only use got. Don't worry too much about these small differences in the past forms of irregular verbs. People in both countries can easily understand both ways, although Brits tend to think of the American way as incorrect. Tag questions. A tag question is a grammatical form that turns a statement into a question. For example, the whole situation is unfortunate, isn't it? Or, you don't like him, do you? The tag includes a pronoun and its matching form of the verb be, have or do. Tag questions encourage people to respond and agree with the speaker. Americans use tag questions, too, but less often than Brits. You can learn more about tag questions on a previous episode of Everyday Grammar. Spelling. There are hundreds of minor spelling differences between British and American English. You can thank American lexicographer Noah Webster for this. You might recognize Webster's name from the dictionary that carries his name. Noah Webster, an author, politician, and teacher, started an effort to reform English spelling in the late 1700s. He was frustrated by the inconsistencies in English spelling. Webster wanted to spell words the way they sounded. Spelling reform was also a way for America to show its independence from England. You can see Webster's legacy in the American spelling of words like color, from color, honor, from honor, and labor, from labor. Webster dropped the letter U from these words to make the spelling match the pronunciation. Other Webster ideas failed, like a proposal to spell women as women. Since Webster's death in 1843, attempts to change spelling rules in American English have gone nowhere. English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, and you'll find it's more than 1 billion speakers just about everywhere. It's fun to note that scientists have even taken the English language to Antarctica. But there are two particular groups of English speakers we'll focus on in this article, and they are the ones who live on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, or what the Brits like to call, the pond. If you've enjoyed some British football, puzzled over a British biscuit, or just watched a little Peppa Pig with your kids recently, we probably won't surprise you when we say there are some key and noteworthy differences in how English functions in the United States versus the United Kingdom. Let's take a quick look at some fun and noteworthy examples of how English vocabulary, slang, spelling, and pronunciation can vary depending on your location. British versus American words, vocabulary and slang. In general, most words mean the same thing in British and American English. For example, the words apple and chair refer to the same objects in both versions of English. For the most part, speakers of American English and British English won't have much trouble at all understanding one another when it comes to vocabulary. However, there are many examples of the same thing being referred to by different words, depending on if you are using American or British English. For a well-known example, British English uses the word football to refer to the sport that Americans know as soccer. For the sport that Americans know as football, Brits use the term American football. This is far from the only example, though. Here are just a few more examples of two different words being used to refer to the same thing. French fries are fries, American, versus chips, British. Words being used to refer to the same thing. Cotton candy, American, versus candy floss, British. Apartment, American, versus flat, British. Garbage, American, versus rubbish, British. Cookie, American, versus biscuit, British. Green thumb, American, versus green fingers, British. Parking lot, American, versus car park, British. Pants, American, versus. Trousers, British. Windshield, American, versus. Windscreen, British. We can find similar examples when we look at slang words. Sometimes, different slang words are used in American and British English to refer to the same things. A wad of mucus, booger, American, versus. Bogey, British. A man, dude, American, versus. Bloke, British. Very good, awesome, American, versus. Ace, British. To chat, shoot the breeze, American, versus. Chinwag, British. An infantry soldier, grunt, American, versus. Squaddy, British. A toilet, John, American, versus. Lou, British. An anonymous man, John Doe, American, versus John Smith, British. To waste time, lollygag, American, versus. Faff about, British. Finally, both American and British English have words that are used exclusively. For example, American English has words like bayou and cleats for which there is no British equivalent. On the other side, British English uses terms like bunts, niff, and jiggery-pokery that don't really have American equivalents. Read about other British slang that may have flummoxed you. British versus American spelling. Generally speaking, most English words are spelled the same in American and British English. However, there are some notable spelling patterns that are preferred depending on which form of English is used. Listed below are just some examples of spelling differences you may encounter. Our, British, versus, or, American. Examples, color versus color, armor versus armor, flavor versus flavor. Eyes or eyes, British, versus only eyes, American. Examples, apologize versus apologize, fantasize versus fantasize, idolize versus idolize. Ice, British, versus eyes, American. Examples, analyze versus analyze, paralyze versus paralyze. Doubling the L in a verb conjugation, British, versus keeping the single L, American. Examples, traveled versus traveled, labeling versus labeling. A, British, versus E, American. Examples, leukemia versus leukemia, pediatrics versus pediatrics. Ents, British, versus ents, American. Examples, defense versus defense. Only og, British, versus og or og, American. Examples, catalog versus catalog, dialogue versus dialogue. British, versus American. Examples, meter versus meter, luster versus luster. In addition to these common patterns, some specific words are spelled differently in American and British English. Some examples include airplane. The first in each pair is the common American term, an aeroplane, grey and grey, tire and tire, and mold and mold. British versus American pronunciation. Before we dive into pronunciation differences, we need to address the elephant in the room. Yes, we know both the United States and the United Kingdom have many different accents and dialects that are spoken in their respective country. In particular, most, but not all, American accents are rhotic, whereas most, but not all, British accents are non-rhotic. This means that most Americans will pronounce the R in certain syllables while most Brits will not, as in the word number, pronounced as number by a non-rhotic speaker. Additionally, even Americans and Brits with the same accent or dialect may pronounce a word differently. Ask some of your friends how they pronounce New Orleans, and you'll probably get a quick example of this. All of that being said, there are many words that, in general, are often pronounced differently by many speakers of British English and American English. Some of these different pronunciations are less dramatic. Here are some examples of words that have relatively minor pronunciation differences. Advertisement. American, advertisement. British, advertisement. Mall. American, mall. British, mal. Missile. American, missile. British, missile. Dynasty. American, dynasty. British, dynasty. Baboon. American, baboon. British, baboon. Learn the difference between different British monetary terms with this look at quid versus pound. Other words have much more dramatic pronunciation differences. Some examples include zebra. American, zebru. British, zebru. Figure. American, figure. British, figure. Sloth. American, sloth. British, sloth. Schedule. American, scale or schedule. British, schedule or schedule. And we'll finish with an especially strange one. Lieutenant. American, lieutenant. British, lieutenant. As you can see, English can change quite a bit when going from Big Ben to the Big Apple. We merely scratched the surface, and there are tons more differences to be found, but you can test yourself on the nuances you've learned here with this quiz. You may want to keep an eye out the next time you check out a word or phrase in our dictionary, because you might just discover a new difference in American and British English you didn't even know about. Not so different after all. British and American English have far more similarities than differences. We think the difference between American and British English is often exaggerated. If you can understand one style, you should be able to understand the other style. With the exception of some regional dialects, most Brits and Americans can understand each other without too much difficulty. They watch each other's TV shows, sing each other's songs, and read each other's books. They even make fun of each other's accents. I'm Jill Robbins. And I'm John Russell. And I'm Claudia Milne. Now it's your turn. What style of English are you learning? Why did you choose it? Write to us in the comments of our YouTube channel of Applied Linguistics comment section or on our Facebook page. Search for Dr. KHALID Malik.
Dr. KHALID Malik, the founder of Applied Linguistics Groups, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL and uploaded this video for BS English students. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities, and was admitted to a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at